Even in those last minutes of his life, Captain Ernst Lehmann refused to believe in sabotage. To him, lightning or a sudden static discharge was the only explanation he could accept. It was the same belief he held from the moment the ship began to fall. Hours later, he was taken by ambulance to the hospital in Lakehurst, wrapped in bandages, drifting in and out of consciousness. Doctors tried to ease his pain, but the burns were too severe. Just after dawn on May 7, 1937, Captain Lehmann died from his injuries. His final word remained the same, Blitzschlag lightning, but others weren't so sure. Investigators from the United States, Germany, and the Zeppelin Company arrived almost immediately. The wreckage was still warm when officials began walking through the twisted metal, searching for answers. Theories spread like smoke, static electricity, leaking hydrogen, fuel line sparks, sabotage. Newspapers printed whatever rumors they could gather, each headline more dramatic than the last. And because several German officers had been on board in civilian clothes, whispers of espionage became almost impossible to silence. Passengers reported strange smells hours before landing. A few crewmen remembered hearing a muffled sound before the fire. The massive static charge from the storm made experts wonder if the ship had become an electrical trap. And then there was the anonymous warning letter Captain Lehmann kept folded in his pocket. The one he thought would never come true, but something else surfaced. Newspaper printed at the time. One badly injured survivor, still trembling in the hospital, told investigators he saw a flash inside the ship before the outer skin ignited. He insisted it wasn't lightning. Another crewman swore he heard a sharp, metallic pop like a snapped wire or punctured gas cell moments before flames erupted. Their accounts were written down quietly, sealed into reports, and buried under official explanations. Publicly, the U.S. investigation concluded that leaking hydrogen ignited likely due to static electricity. Germany accepted the same conclusion. It was simple, understandable, and not political. Privately, the truth was far less certain. Some officials noted that the fire started exactly where gas cell 5 set, one of the few cells that had shown minor structural issues on previous flights. Others pointed out that the outer covering of the ship had been coated with chemicals that behaved like rocket fuel when ignited. Behind closed doors, investigators debated whether the spark had come from a wire, a tear in the fabric, or something placed, but the most chilling piece of testimony came decades later from the last living survivor, and he said something no one else dared. On his deathbed, he admitted that several passengers that night were not who they claimed to be, that at least 2 men boarded under false identities, and that one of them behaved strangely in the hours before the fire, moving through restricted areas. Watching crewmen slipping away when questioned, he claimed he saw an object, metallic, tucked beneath the man's coat as he passed through the gallery walkway. When asked why he'd stayed silent for 77 years, the survivor simply said, "Because they told me the truth would destroy everything." He did not name who they were. He didn't need to. According to him, the Hindenburg wasn't simply a transportation tragedy. It was a warning, a test. And the explosion, whether accidental or engineered, was the beginning of something much darker, hidden behind government files that still remain classified in parts. Even today, what happened that night was more than a fire. It was a spark that illuminated secrets the world wasn't ready to face and, perhaps still isn't. Captain Ernst Lehmann's final whisper, Blitzschlag, hung in the air like a ghost. Lightning. The word echoed through the infirmary, through Adelt's memory, and eventually through the halls of the investigations that followed. But it solved nothing. It only deepened the mystery. Lehmann died the next day, his burns too severe. His last breath carried that single word, but no one could say for sure whether it was clarity or confusion from unbearable pain. His death marked the end of an era, but for many, it also silenced a man who might have known far more than he ever revealed. As Lehmann slipped away, investigators from the United States, Germany, and the Zeppelin Company crowded into rooms filled with photographs, sketches, and burned fragments of aluminum. Every theory from static discharge to sabotage to structural failure was examined with relentless intensity. Experts argued for hours about the ship's final seconds. Some insisted the fire had started near gas cell 4, others swore it began closer to gas cell 5 or 9. Some said it was the port side engine, others the top bridge walkway. Witnesses contradicted one another endlessly. No two stories matched perfectly. But one thing was certain, something had ignited the hydrogen, and whatever it was, it happened in the shadows, fast, silent, devastating. In the weeks that followed, strange things began to surface. A mechanic named Albert Rode, who had worked on the ship before takeoff, revealed that he'd seen something unusual during the pre-flight inspection, a small tear in the outer fabric near the tail. He reported it, but said the officers dismissed it as minor cosmetic damage. Another crew member remembered hearing a faint hissing the day before departure. He assumed it was a valve issue, something the engineers would handle, but no report was ever filed. A ground worker at Lakehurst swore he had seen a flicker like a spark or flash near the rear of the ship, just milliseconds before the flame erupted. He said it looked like electricity jumping across the air. Investigators couldn't agree if these clues meant sabotage, or simply a tragic chain of mechanical errors. But then there were the passengers. Several were never quite who they seemed. The United States investigation team quietly identified, at least for passengers who carried false documentation, fake professions, vague backgrounds, and untraceable contacts. One was a businessman who owned no business. Another, a journalist, carried no press credentials. A third, a man traveling alone, had purchased a last-minute ticket in cash using a false name. Two German intelligence officers, traveling incognito, raised additional questions. Their presence wasn't unusual, not entirely, but their behavior during the flight caught attention. One officer, Colonel Fritz Erdmann, had spent several hours near the rear of the ship on the final day, claiming he wanted to observe structural features. Another, Major Hans Hugo Witt, admitted he'd been alerted that sabotage might be attempted, though he insisted no such mission was assigned to them. Then there was the anonymous bomb threat mailed to Lehman. The U.S. investigators kept that letter hidden for months. It surfaced only after journalists began digging aggressively. When it leaked, newspapers exploded with speculation. Headlines screamed, "BOMB warning, ignored prior to Hindenburg disaster, secret letter sent to captain." Was it sabotage? German officials knew of threat. Did they cover it up? The truth was murky. The letter was real. Lehman had carried it onto the flight, and someone, somewhere, had known more than they ever said. Then came perhaps the most chilling testimony of all, one that investigators did not publicize for decades. A ground crew member named Robert Buchanan described something he had never mentioned publicly before. When the mooring ropes fell, he grabbed a port rope and began hauling. That moment, he said, he felt a tiny electric jolt travel down the line, not enough to hurt, but enough to feel through his hands. Moments later, the top of the ship ignited. Electrical engineers later suggested the possibility that wet rope touching the damp earth could create a grounding effect, discharging static electricity through the ship's frame. But no one could prove this conclusively. Hard evidence remained elusive. As the investigation dragged on, the world reacted with grief, rage, and disbelief. Airships, once the elegant future of travel, were suddenly terrifying relics. Public trust collapsed overnight. Within weeks, ticket sales plummeted. The Zeppelin company canceled future flights. Construction on new ships halted. The dream of transatlantic Zeppelin travel, decades in the making, died with the flames at Lakehurst. The Hindenburg sister ship, the LZ-130 Graf Zeppelin II, was tested briefly but never used for commercial flights. It was dismantled in 1940. Its metal went into the German war effort. 4 airships. The sky had closed. But the most mysterious chapter came decades later, long after the wreckage had been cleared, long after survivors had aged, long after the world had moved on. One man still carried a secret. His name was Werner Franz, the boy who had escaped the inferno wet but alive. For most of his life, Franz gave simple interviews. He modeled airship replicas. He attended memorials. He spoke about luck, fate, adrenaline, and the miracle of survival. But there was always one thing he kept to himself. Only near the end of his life, when he was in his late 80s, did he share it with a close friend, a historian, who later described that conversation but never publicly named himself. According to this historian, Franz revealed something that haunted him for 77 years. He said that minutes before the fire, while cleaning the officers' mess, he heard muffled voices in the keel walkway. Not unusual, but the tone was urgent, almost angry. 2 men were arguing quietly, too quietly for him to hear the words, but not quietly enough to hide the tension. He remembered recognizing one of the voices.